Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the future of waste management, which asks whether a truly circular economy is possible. Today's webinar is brought to you by waste management platform Cyrkl. I'm James Langley, the senior reporter at letsrecycle.com, a publication which provides waste management and recycling news and information for industry, councils and the third sector. I'd now like to introduce each of our speakers for the day. I'm very pleased to say that with us today we have Dr. Simon Ellin, CEO of the Recycling Association, Joshua Palfremen, Senior Global Practice Specialist in Waste Management at DAI, and Roland Thompson, UK Waste and Recycling Expert Cyrkl. So welcome to you all. The way the webinar will work is that we'll have a short presentation from each of our speakers before a question and answer session at the end. There's a grey box in the top right hand corner of your screen, which you can use to ask questions at any point during the webinar. These questions will be answered in the Q&A session at the end. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Simon Ellin. Simon has worked in the recycling industry for more than 30 years, starting in local government. He then held a variety of roles as a mill buyer and depot manager in the paper industry. Simon joined Independent Waste Paper Producers, the Recycling Association's trading arm, as commercial director in 2009. In 2011, Simon became chief executive of both the Recycling Association and the trading arm. Under Simon's stewardship, the association has flourished. He's made a number of high-profile appearances on national television and radio, promoting the benefits of recycling, and I'm sure he'll be very familiar to a lot of you. The Recycling Association now counts a record 119 companies as members, so please take it away, Simon.
Thanks, James. Nice build-up. Waiting for my slides. Yeah, wonderful. Next slide, please, Abby. Okay, so trying to sort of set the background of the circular economy in about 10 minutes is, as you can imagine, incredibly difficult to do. And I'm just going to cover a few of the relevant points just to get the juices flowing, if you like. Look at some of the barriers facing us, short, medium and long term. But just a bit of background who we are. Well, the Recycling Association, we were formed in 1975 as Independent Waste Paper Producers Association, a cooperative-like organisation where independent paper merchants basically pooled their tonnage to get a better price and gain national contracts, etc. It was a phenomenally successful model, and because it became so influential, it automatically morphed into a trade association, so much so that we rebranded to the Recycling Association about 15 years ago. But I think the relevance of the background in particular is that we are still significantly funded by our own brokerage company, IWPP Limited, which I also am CEO of. So I have a bit of a crazy job. On the one hand, running a £10 million commercial trading business, and then on the other hand, doing all the political lobbying membership support for the association. But the relevance of that is that, and it gives us a unique insight, I think, into the circular economy and the markets, because we're operating in them. And my sleepless nights are never association, it's always the commercial side of things, because it is getting harder and harder. And I'm going to touch on some of these, you know, as possible barriers to, or not possible barriers, as definitive barriers to the circular economy. And as you see there, the markets that we serve in that order are the EU, the UK and the rest of the world. So we are very reliant on the export market. And I would say, out of many challenges that we have, which I'll touch on in a bit, is the biggest challenge that we face, and that's we as IWPP, but I think as our industry as a whole, is, you know, how do we produce a circular economy ready product? You know, and there are challenges there. Next slide, please, Amy. So, just a bit of background to the circular economy. I mean, there's all sorts of definitions, but I think probably one of the simplest and better ones I've seen is the Ellen MacArthur one on the left there. You know, in our current economy, we take materials from the earth, make products from them, and eventually throw them away as waste. The process is linear. In a circular economy, by contrast, we stop waste being produced in the first place. And I think we probably are all on board with that in terms of a broad definition. So can it be achieved? Well, of course it can be achieved, but there are, I think, lots of difficulties and barriers, and not just related to the concept itself, but the market and the environment that it works in. And it's not a standalone entity, is it? A circular economy, it's a whole system, framework, solution approach that tackles many things, and involves many things, not least climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, etc. So there are so many other environmental entities and externalities, etc., which come into the picture. And of course, to produce a product, to keep the material in circular, there are so many other things that come into the equation. Not least, it has to be underpinned by clean renewable energy. What's the point, if we buy into this, of underpinning the circular economy by burning fossil fuels, and the overall carbon impact that might have, which sort of, I was having a conversation with Matt Crocker. I don't know whether many of you know, who used to work for the agency, now a consultant, and he's actually working with myself and the ESA to achieve end of waste on paper at the moment. And he was saying, and I sort of agree with him really, that the circular economy itself now is almost an outdated concept, and that we should be more sort of focusing on sort of carbon and water as the output of a circular economy. And I think we need to look into it much deeper than just moving away from a linear model. There are so many other factors that are inputting into it and outputting from it, and there are many important decisions to be made, some of which I'm just going to cover quickly now on the next slide. So, I really could talk about this for a couple of hours, and it would probably turn into one of my typical rants, but I'll try and rein it in a little bit and just sort of cover some of the difficulties that I think we face. And I don't want you to sort of look at this in terms of I'm being really negative towards a circular economy. I'm fully supportive of a circular economy, but we've got to be realistic that there are many barriers that are still facing us to achieve it. And I've just picked out a few here. Right at the front of it, underpinning everything at the moment, is energy costs. The UK has the highest business energy costs in Europe, and one of the highest on a worldwide global scale as well. And that's a huge barrier for us. And we hear about the UK circular economy, we hear about keeping materials on these shores, but the immediate problem that you've got, if you can afford your startup costs and you've got the investment in the first place, you're immediately millions of dollars behind the curve in terms of your energy costs. And a figure that rings with me is when I was trying to facilitate some Chinese investment into a paper mill in the UK a few years ago now, for a 500,000 ton mill, which is probably quite a small one nowadays. The immediate barrier was that their energy costs were going to be $20 million $20 million a year more than it would be if they'd have built the facility in China itself. So you got an immediate barrier facing investment in the UK. We have very complex supply chains in the UK and everywhere really, and it is a global supply chain. And again, one link in that supply chain, and I guess this is what the resources and waste strategy was trying to address. You break one of those links, then your circular economy plans can fall flat. Where's the information that where is the data? Who can we go to on product design? We've still got this demonisation of materials in there, and I'm referring to plastics. And maybe a bit of a controversial thing to say, but the plastics has become the devil, whereas in fact the plastics handled responsibly are not the devil. It is a very, very good circular material if we handle it properly. We have archaic planning laws. If you want to put a mill down in China in 12 months, you'll have a mill in China. If you want to put one down in the UK in 3 years, you probably still haven't gone through the planning process. So again, another barrier. And underpinning everything, and we've really got a handle on this, is our archaic and underfunded over-regulation system in the UK. There's so many barriers out there. I feel sorry for the agency, and in lots of ways, they're so underfunded. But do they always work as smartly as they can? Maybe not. The other thing I'd just like to put in here, and I'm nearly at my 10 minutes, and this is so important to us, so incredibly important in the waste management industry for us, is that, we are not a UK circular economy. We are a global circular economy. And, why do the UK export so much material? And let's use the example of paper. We collect 7.5 million tonnes a year, and we export over 4 million tonnes of that. Why do we do that? The reason is because we import so much packaging, and if we import the packaging, then it stands to reason that we should export it back to where it comes. Yet, we're talking about export bans. Export again is the devil. So we ban the export of materials. Where the hell does it go? Is the circular economy about putting it in a landfill? Is it about, at best, burning that resource? I don't think it is. So again, we've got to look at ways, rather than this blunt instrument ban it, let's find ways of making it work. And I think that's where the resources and the waste strategy comes in, which we got very excited about, and personally I thought it was, by and large, a very good strategy. But will we ever see it? Where is it? Still, with austerity and the cost of living and energy and everything else, will we ever see it? And just this, going back to my first slide about how a circular economy works, and the resources and the waste strategy underpinning that in the UK, is the resources and the waste strategy, flawed itself? Is DRS really the best way of collecting material in a circular economy? What are the carbon effects of DRS? Of collecting small amounts, processing small amounts, and then within DRS itself, we've got the concept of zoning, setting up whole industrial estates to be serviced by one contractor to cut down on vehicle movements. And yet in DRS, we're introducing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of vehicle movements. So how do those two fit together? And I've just sort of don't use those to be a bit controversial, but we really got to think about this holistically. We've got to look at carbon, we've got to look at water, and we've got to make sure that we're making the correct decisions and that we're not political showboating. It frustrates the living life out of me that we get decisions made. Just a very simple one to illustrate my point, that retailers moving from a plastic microwavable recyclable tray to a fibre one, which becomes unrecyclable because it's contaminated with food. Are we making the right decisions? Have we got the right data that's behind our decisions? And will now the whole thing happen with austerity? Who knows? So I've done quite well there to fit probably a 2-hour rant into 13 minutes. Sorry, I've overrun a little bit, but thanks everyone for listening.
No, don't worry at all, Simon. That was a fascinating overview, so thank you very much. Next up, we have Joshua Palfremen. To give you a little of his background, Joshua is a senior global practice specialist at DAI, tasked with developing and establishing waste management practice. Joshua specialises in waste management, recycling, water security, sanitation and hygiene. He has sound knowledge of integrated solid waste management planning, infrastructure design, municipal service planning and private sector development. He draws this knowledge from postgraduate study, 12 years of professional experience and geographical specialities in Eastern, Southern and Western Africa, North Africa, South America, the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Before joining DAI, Joshua directed his own environmental planning and consultancy company, designing, leading and monitoring complex technical programs in team leader roles for several organisations, including the US Agency for International Development, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the World Bank Group and others. Joshua also founded and co-directs an on-site waste management recycling company and a black soldier fly composting company in Kenya and Tanzania. So Joshua, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, James. I think you guys can hear me. And yeah, we weren't made aware about the presentation opportunity, so I'll just present a bit on what DAI does as an organization. We're kind of one of the largest global international development contractors. We have 12 global offices around the world. Our largest one probably in Washington, DC, several in the United Kingdom. And we work very closely with USAID and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and other donor institutions, which I'm very kind of pleased to say in the last couple of years have caught up and started initiating very large and very real ocean plastics programs. So we're seeing a really kind of dedicated interest in this from different donor institutions around the world. But there's not a lot of thought leadership precedent there kind of among those donor institutions, and that's where DAI can often help. We have quite a lot of experience in the kind of more brick and mortar solid waste management field, but as that solid waste management field focuses more on this circular economy topic, on ESG, on kind of corporate compliance, and on this kind of topic of ocean plastics, I think DAI is kind of one of the market leaders, and we're working on a number of exciting programs. We've just come back actually from the 7IMDC conference in Busan and the ISWA conference that Roland will be very aware of in Singapore. We'll also be at COP, and then I think 2022 is representing for myself and for the colleagues and the experts who I'm speaking to probably the most pivotal year for kind of legislative frameworks and legislative progression in this area. We'll be in Uruguay for the INC, for the UNEA 5.2 plastics agreement, which is really kind of the starting point, but I think also kind of a really bold step towards programming more kind of progressive approach towards plastics. I suppose because I have a couple of minutes, I really enjoyed Simon's initial presentation, and I noted kind of a couple of experiences that I can draw from, I suppose, international practice, which is where DAI has most of its operations. We're operating in dozens of countries, mostly in the developing world. And I grew up and kind of started, some of my business activities in the United Kingdom. I'm now based in kind of South Africa and travel, at least 200 days of the year for different projects. I do agree, just like in the United Kingdom, like Simon was saying, there's a huge amount of red tape in this. Very often we're arguing in a lot of our programs that if you're providing a recycling service as a private sector investor, you're effectively providing an in-kind public utility municipal service, and you should have more favorable taxation. I do agree with Simon that plastics perhaps have been demonized. If you look at this from an LCA approach, paper and glass and other kind of alternatives, are not scalable, they're not alternative when you reach critical mass, and they often have higher life cycle emissions than plastic. With that being said, I do believe that there's a good discourse going towards problem plastics. And what I mean by this is that really, if you look at circular economy activities with plastics, people are very opportunistically just cherry picking the cream of the crop. They're just really looking for clear and light blue PET, and at least 5 of the 7 core subtypology groups I'm finding right across kind of middle income as well as industrialized economies are just being ignored. That the recycling logo is indiscriminately just being put on everything, as a bit of a cop-out or a greenwashing strategy, and that opaque plastics or plastics with too many fillers, or plastics with too many layers, you don't have a strong argument for why they're still in the market. It's extremely difficult to recycle them, and yet companies quite dishonestly keep on putting the recyclable logo on them. So from a circular economy perspective, what I'm looking forward to in this discussion is how do you correspond to a lot of the good intentions? There's a huge amount of idealism in this market, particularly around this ocean plastics topic. How do you correspond idealism with functional supply chains that service industry and service fast-moving consumer business models? And furthermore, how do you connect idealism and good intentions? When you go to the INC and you're trying to create a plastics agreement, it's very easy to sign up to pledges that ambiguously and arbitrarily, sign delegates up to kind of reducing plastic pollution. But what does that really mean? How do you actually correspond that with functional, legal, and fiscal structures that already exist? And I'm glad that Simon mentioned carbon credits, because you see that's kind of, I think, a fledgling business model that functions because it's corresponding with the rails of an existing fiscal supply chain. carbon credits and plastic credits are founded on the basis of, basic economic principles that an economist will understand, or basic principles that a lawyer or kind of a legal structure in a different country is going to understand how to correspond with those type of legislation. But there's a lot of idealism that is not founded on existing legal structures, that if you walked into a room with lawyers and economists, they would have no idea how to integrate your best intentions into an actual supply chain that functions and still serves fast-moving consumer good demand. So maybe we'll get into that a bit later in the questions that I have previewed, and I'll pass over to Roland. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Josh. That's a nice introduction. I'd now like to introduce Roland Thompson to the webinar. Roland is country manager for the UK and Ireland at Cyrkl. He's focused on improving the efficiency and sustainability of material use in the UK. Roland is an expert in both waste management and recycling, as well as the commercial and practical realities of low impact material use. His experience in the paper recycling industry has given him detailed knowledge of material sourcing, EPR systems, municipal solid waste and logistics. Across the public and private sector, Roland has a shrewd understanding of how to extract value from secondary materials, not only for the positive benefits to the environment, but for measurable improvements to the bottom line as well. Before joining Cyrkl, Roland left his business development office role at Impact in South Africa to move to Madrid to get his MBA and work in renewable energy. He's also the current chair of the Young Professionals Group at the International Solid Waste Association, ISWA, helping to nurture the next generation of waste professionals. So Roland, please take the stage.
Thanks very much, James, and thanks also to Josh and Simon. Some really interesting comments there. Perhaps just to begin, a little bit of background about the place where I work, which is Cyrkl. So I mean, what we do is we're a waste platform, or even ecosystem, you could call us. I think a lot of what we actually do links back to some of the questions that the other speakers sort of raised, or the themes that the other speakers raised. To begin with, Josh kind of mentioned operating within the rails of the structures that already exist. And in many ways, what we try to do at Cyrkl is operate within the rails of capitalism to leverage capitalism in the allocation of scarce resources, in our case, waste and secondary materials. So I mean, we're big believers in the power of the network. We really believe that integrating the value chain is one of the key mechanisms to enable the circular economy and create the connections necessary for materials to find better uses and more efficient uses. I think something that Simon mentioned also got me thinking, and that's the way that local processing power essentially is affected, or even the investment in local processing power is affected by the cost of energy. And for me, that's very much about economics, because if the UK starts to decrease their processing power, that's where the division of labor comes in. Is there somewhere else, preferably closer, where processing power does exist? And what I try to do every day is find out if that's possible and connect those people to create efficiencies in the system. I really liked also what Josh said about what is essentially what I like to call the homogeneity problem of plastics, which is, to what degree do we try and create homogeneity in order to improve the propensity or probability that plastics can be recycled, while balancing the characteristics that are essential for the uses of said plastics. This is a really fascinating sort of theme for me, and of course I see it in my everyday job, that the demand for plastics with greater homogeneity is just clear compared to those of sort of multi-laminates or multi-plastic items. So for me, really happy to be here with such interesting people, and I'll give it back to James, our moderator, to continue.
Thanks very much, Roland. That's great. We now have some time for some questions and some discussion. Just to reiterate what I said earlier, you can pose questions at any point via the grey box in the top right-hand corner of your screen. First off, we have a nice broad question from the floor from Jennifer. How can legislation drive a circular economy in the UK? What more could the government do to help? I mean, maybe Simon, you could kick us off from this. Sorry, Simon, I think you're on mute. Okay, Simon seems to have gone. Josh, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and give kind of a more kind of global approach to this problem. But you know, a really interesting thing that the British government and the EU government has done recently is to have kind of a much higher quota required for rPET and PCR plastic, post-consumer recycled plastic. I see this as kind of in the 15 years that I've been working in this industry as the biggest legislative kind of impact on commodity pricing. If you look at that, you know, the PET recycling market that I mentioned is very opportunistically recycled and does represent quite a low-hanging fruit in circular economy. Nevertheless, it was always kind of bullied around by, you know, the price of crude oil, by export and import bans. You've now created a legislative kind of incentive for it, you know, people to go out and kind of find the rPET. This is tremendously exciting, and in a lot of the countries we're operating in, even in landlocked cities and landlocked states, there are now PET recycling value chains and waste pickers being enabled to recycle the PET because it's reached a commodity price which is reasonable for them to pick and collect it. So it's a really good example of how, you know, a legislative shift has massive economic knock-on effects, you know, beneficial knock-on effects. Previously, a lot of these fast-moving consumer good petrochemical companies could simply pick up the phone and call ExxonMobil and ask for their consignment for the next 2 years. They now have to go to a host of hundreds and hundreds of different kind of mom and pop shops in like rural sub-Saharan Africa where we're working, or Southeast Asia, to find, you know, small consignments, even 60, 100, 150 metric tons of PET per month, so that they can meet this rPET quota. I would put it even higher. You've seen PepsiCo and a couple of other corporate companies have gone above and beyond legislative requirements and said, we're happy to create all plastic bottles going forward from rPET. So I think that would be kind of the most promising example I've seen of recent. Back to you.
Yeah, Simon, I see you've rejoined us. Sorry, we lost you for a moment, but yeah, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. I think it goes back to really what, you know, the legislation-wise, the thing that will, could, should underpin the UK again is the resources and the waste strategy, you know, under the Environment Bill. And I think particularly, well, two things particularly stand out for me in that, you know, is the plastics tax, you know, and plastics to me is the problem area. You know, it's the area that we do need to address. Not saying that everything else, you know, runs smoothly, but it is the problem area that we've got to find solutions for. And I also think as well, it's the area where there is the greatest opportunity for UK investment because of, you know, sort of lower energy costs associated with it, and perhaps the margins that the plastic tax will give us. You know, it's interesting that I know we still don't have a timescale for this, but, you know, let's say it's a couple of years away. You know, Recoup produced a report. That was launched at their conference, saying that we are still a million miles away from the investment in the UK processing capacity, you know, to handle the amounts of materials that we're gonna collect. And it goes back to what I was saying, you know, that also in the EPR and in the waste shipment regulation reform in Europe, you know, is this concept of banning the export of plastics. And you know, I would say, you know, if you collect films and flexibles, for example, you know, going back to what Josh was saying about, you know, the multi-layered stuff that are very difficult to recycle, you know, if you're collecting it and you don't have the processing capacity and you can't export it, where does it go? You know, and I know that's a very, very simple concept, but that does worry me. We do need, you know, holistic solutions for this. And the only other thing I would say on that, and I could talk about it again for a long time, you know, is with EPR, the money has got to get to the right areas. You know, and, you know, very much I'm in agreement that it should help fund local authority collections and the consistency of collections and core materials, you know, so that we can improve, and the modulated fee side of things, you know, to improve the design of the materials. But it's also got to get down to you know, the dirty end, as I would call it, you know, the areas that we work in. And I was, you know, very encouraged to see that sense prevailed, and that it looked like government will retain the PRN system, the packaging recovery note system, which I know is not a perfect system, but, you know, with reform, it is a system that very much works. And, you know, you look at the moment where we are struggling big time in terms of austerity and materials, but and collection of materials, and that everything's dropped off the cliff. But, you know, we are still on track to meet the target through the PRN system. You know, it's kicked in, prices have gone up, and it's encouraged collection. So yeah, you know, those are the areas, and we just hope that, you know, common sense prevails, that the resources and waste strategy does come in, and that we do, you know, the reformed PRN system is one that's fit for the purpose and will encourage, you know, collection and processing of materials.
Yeah, I mean, Roland, Simon's just addressed the kind of availability of recovered plastic there. I don't know, from a UK or a global perspective, how can we increase the availability of recovered plastic to make legislation function?
So, I mean, that's an interesting question, and in some ways, it's the other way around, I see, or a little bit, sometimes one way around, sometimes the other way around. But I think if I answer your question directly, for me, this goes back again to homogeneity, because homogeneity, as Josh said, creates commodities, and when you have commodities, you have the right incentives to get businesses to start operating, to get businesses to kind of have a reason to invest time, resources in the collection of said material. So for me, one interesting thing is that the consumer needs to be educated that they have a lot more power to change recycling rates than simply being recyclers. They are the ones that big producers listen to. They are the ones who big governments listen to, because hey, they're voters and they're consumers. They spend money and they vote. And I think something very interesting, which I would kind of perhaps one day like to address a bit more, is the power of the consumer to encourage government to legislate uniformity in material, so that big brands can, you know, deliver that uniformity and material can be commoditized better, because that's surely the best way to improve recovery rates.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Josh, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do think consumers do have some choice. I think in developing countries, it's a little bit more difficult among the urban poor. I think also kind of educational and behavior change education initiatives are often novel, but other times I see them kind of being used as too much of an opportunistic greenwashing tactic. If you look at this, you know, RPET tactic, I mean, that really doesn't have anything to do with consumer choice. The government has kind of noted that there's enough RPET in the supply chain. They've told people, you know, or told kind of fast-moving consumer good kind of petrochemical companies, it's definitely there. It's going to be more of a headache for you to go and procure RPET from hundreds of different suppliers and ensure quality control and renegotiate with your insurers, rather than just going to ExxonMobil or Shell, for example. But you can do it, and that's going to make, that's a market system. It's a functional market system through conventional economic models that they could very elegantly weave into the mix. You know, it's a very non-idealistic kind of, you know, economic model that functions very well. Consumers could make a difference, but I mean, you would need a boycott level of kind of consumers against a singular brand. And I think you have too much individualistic behavior to really do that. Also, you know, what does a consumer know about the impact of opacity on the ability to recycle a PET bottle. It's not right that we can expect a consumer to understand those things, where I think, you know, a chemical engineer can go to an industry and say, hey, stop creating that sports drink in a non-transparent bottle because it's a huge nuisance to recycle it. And you and I both know, because we're both chemical engineers, no one's going to recycle that. You know, stop putting the recyclable logo on opaque plastics and have in the EPR a level of granularity in your stipulations that say that you can't have, you know, levels of opacity that are too high that it becomes prohibitively expensive to recycle them. I think that's, you know, kind of a non-consumer based functional model that could really help out with plastic recycling.
Yeah, Simon, I see you nodding. Kind of, how does the waste industry practice what it preaches and sets the standard in how it creates circular behaviours?
Yeah, a good question, James, and to a degree we've actually led on this, and I was nodding from what Josh was saying, because we and about consumerism and how important it is, because not to blow our own trumpets, but we sort of really kick-started the debate on all of this when we did the Pringles Lucozade bottle expose on the BBC 5 or 6 years ago now. And the one thing that brought home to me, and it was such a light bulb moment on that when we did it, that day we were trending in the top 5 in Twitter, and we were #1 hit worldwide on the BBC website. And the light bulb moment for me was that, you know, it engaged with the consumer, you know, and it was probably for the first time for a lot of the consumers that they'd ever actually thought about the products that they were buying in terms of their recyclability. And I'm not saying that we're responsible for the whole of the revolution, but, you know, but pretty soon after that, you know, a lot of the brands, and you know, I visited the Pringles factory not that long ago, and I suspect there's going to be some exciting news to follow. You know, Suntory, who own Lucozade, have already redesigned their product range, and we're seeing fantastic amounts of work in other areas too. And I think very key that, you know, as maybe at the beginning of all of this, the producer or the retailer or the retailer looked at this as, you know, a cost and a pain in the backside. I think they've actually realised now that it's actually, you know, a marketing opportunity, and the fight to be the greenest brand, I think, you know, is organically already changing the way that, you know, without even EPR, that materials are being looked at. And I was on a call yesterday with Tesco's, and you know, they were telling me that you know, they managed to remove 1 billion plastic items, you know, from their range, you know, which is phenomenal. You know, still a long way to go, and with the caveat, and I think it's Josh has mentioned this several times, you know, greenwashing. You know, we've got to be very careful about, you know, where this sits, and actually what is good and what is working and what is required and what is carbon beneficial and everything else, and what actually is just sticking a label on it so that it looks good. And it's almost, you know, a deception, you know, and greenwashing, and you know, these are some of the areas that we've got to address, James, as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that perception is very important in this journey, and like you were saying earlier, Simon, that there's a certain amount of demonisation of exports, which you say is unjustified. Some people could disagree. Roland, is exporting waste for recycling delaying our transition to a circular economy?
Good question. So I mean, I was actually looking at some stats about the UK's exports this morning, and I saw like the exports of plastics have been steadily decreasing since over the last 20 years, while imports have been increasing, and we have like pretty stable recycling rates of kind of the low to mid 40%. So I mean, for me, it's a very interesting thing, because the UK is importing more plastic, exporting less plastic. So is there a trend that is actually quite good? And in fact, like, are we already on our way to being better? I mean, I'm aware that some of that plastic gets incinerated. I think there's over 100 incinerators in the UK. But I mean, the reality is that there are resources that don't need to be exported, and in many ways, according to those stats, are being exploited right now.
So yeah, Josh, how can we kind of encourage investment in waste infrastructure, or perhaps in particular plastic recycling infrastructure in the UK?
Well, you know, if you look at the way that we do this in emerging economies, again, just because DAI doesn't practice and implement programs in the United Kingdom, you know, we try and look at kind of what is the main service that this company is providing. So I think it's a little bit unfair to, you know, to class a waste management company or a waste recycling company the same as you would kind of class a shopping mall or a cinema, for example, or a supermarket. You know, even if they are kind of exclusively and religiously focusing on just recycling clear and light blue PET bottles, let's say this, you know, they are still diverting a lot of waste from landfill. And there are a lot of existing economic and carbon models that would price that at a certain quantity, that would say that this diversion from landfill is equivalent to this council would have spent on landfilling airspace, on transport, on diesel emissions, for example. So I think a more preferential kind of tax arrangement for these recycling companies would be fair. Again, they are providing effectively an in-kind public utility service to consumers by diverting waste from landfill, which I think is something that needs to be rewarded. And you know, if you were to go a step further, governments know exactly how to do this because, you know, just to throw this into the mix, they provide huge amounts of subsidies for petrochemical extraction. So, you know, you have a little bit of a paradox here where, you know, like it's government knows exactly how to facilitate a business or how to facilitate innovation through preferential tax arrangements. It does this extraordinarily well for petrochemical firms that are producing single-use plastics. It should do so as well for the recyclers who are trying to extract those plastics and prevent them from reaching landfills.
I mean, Simon, in your experience, how can we utilise the EU market in our transition towards a circular economy? And what's the impact of Brexit?
I mean, going back, which I suppose Josh will part answer the question, just to add what the other guys were saying regarding exports of plastics now from the UK and where it goes and what the risk is. I think largely influenced by the Basel Convention that is coming to play. You know, the UK exports now to non-OECD countries is around about 2% of all exports. You know, and I think we'd all acknowledge that non-OECD is a sort of a higher risk area than perhaps, you know, sending material into Europe or closer to home. And also some data I saw the other day as well, which would indicate that, you know, overall stocks of containers of plastics that are not fit for the purpose for export again has dropped dramatically. And again, the big problem area that arose, you know, last year, you know, Turkey and the amount of material that was going there unregulated, you know, that's dropped off a cliff as well. You know, Turkey have got their own act together internally. Basel has helped stymie it, and I think, you know, greater government, greater environment agency regulatory enforcement has improved that. So we have got a lot better on that, absolutely. How important is Europe? Well, Europe's a growing market, James, for lots of materials, you know, despite Brexit. Albeit, you know, that there are barriers there now. You know, intra-EU movements of plastics allow a 6% non-plastic tolerance. Everything else is 2%, you know, outside of Europe. And so, you know, the material that we export now to Europe has only got a 2% tolerance as opposed to 6% internal. So that's a challenge, you know, to get material to that level of quality. You know, what has Brexit done? We're an incredibly resilient bunch, aren't we? You know, I mean, Brexit has been, you know, a spanner in the works, you know, and I don't think anybody can deny that, you know. And if I look at IWPP's movements of fibre, to be fair, not plastics into Europe, you know, our costs have gone up. I would have said maybe a couple of months ago our costs have gone up by a third. I would say our costs have now actually gone up now by a half into Europe. and that is as a result of, the customs process and how drawn out it is. It's down to, fuel prices, obviously, as well. It's down to labour prices, which again has been affected by Brexit. And it's down to the availability of transport, because quite simply, we don't have the same amount of traffic coming in and out of the country. And a lot of the jobs that we used to do on back hauls, etc., has now stopped because of Brexit, and therefore it's more difficult to get vehicles. A lot of the time they'd rather go back empty because they don't want the queues at the ports and all the ensuing paperwork issues. So it has been, James, I think, without being political, a negative. But we are resilient, and we are still managing to get material in there, albeit it's costing us a lot more than it was, and we just have to factor it into the price, and ultimately, who pays for this, James? It's you and I as the public, because it factors back up the system, and it increases the costs of the goods that we're buying at the supermarket. It's called inflation. And Brexit, to me, in terms of products and the packaging, has undoubtedly contributed to that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a question from the floor from Neil Pitcairn, who's asked, how do we avoid a repeat of the scandal of plastics intended for recycling ending up in Poland, stacked in fields or fed into cement kilns? Is better enforcement possible, and who pays, the recycling industry or the virgin plastic producer? And I think the question of who pays is very important, really. I don't know, would anyone like to take that one?
I mean, in terms of, James, sorry, I don't want to dominate it, but it's something that we work into. Poland has undoubtedly, improved. There is less material going out there. Basel has made a difference in that, and the regulations made a difference. But I think what is going to make a difference in all of this is data and waste tracking. And we at the Recycling Association, we've invested in our own export tracking system, which is and will be based on blockchain technology. And it's about saying, in the crazy thing that to get to get a load of plastics to Poland as we stand, you need a document called an Annex 7, which is a piece of paper, and a piece of paper in 2022 that can go missing and isn't completely filled in. It's just crazy. Why don't we supply the regulator with this material digitally, so that we know exactly what it is, where it's come from, and where it's going to, and then it actually gets there, and then it gets to end destinations that are fully audited and approved to say, yes, we can handle these things. And then you can pinpoint by GPS, within a few meters that it actually gets there. Let's embrace technology. Let's not bang it over the head in this blunt instrument to say, ban it, ban it, ban it. Let's just do it better.
Yeah, I mean, Roland or Josh, do either of you have any thoughts on how we could enforce regulations better?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would kind of perhaps like to add is, yeah, I mean, there has been situations like that in Poland, but I mean, from what my team in Poland, who, we have a team of sort of 4 or 5 who work there, and I mean, what they've seen is actually, in many ways, the creation of new industries. And given that it's a little cheaper to invest there than in the UK, the processing power is being built up. I mean, of course, mixed plastics aren't ideal, but in some situations, it can lead to the creation of new business. Huh?
Yeah,
Thanks.
And I would say much stronger consequences. If you look at some of the most successful single-use plastic bans and where they were implemented, governments didn't ask nicely for people to do the right thing. We've just come from a conference in Singapore. We've worked a lot in Rwanda and Tanzania that have extraordinarily successfully and almost immediately banned single-use plastics. Those weren't, to some degree, there was education and awareness building. But you look at the other side of the coin, you were often imprisoned if you littered or if you broke the rules. You know, I'm not saying go to that extent, but even if you look across the EU, there are some really, you know, strict monetary kind of consequences if you don't bale your newspapers and tie them with twine and leave them outside of your door at this specific municipality in Switzerland. That's the kind of level, I think, of enforcement that you need to instigate behavior change. People aren't just going to do it because it's the right thing to do. You're going to have a bad day at work next week. It's going to be the first thing that falls off the shelf. It needs to be much more of a holistic approach, and government needs to decide that this is a political priority for them, that this is a hill that they're willing, you know, to break their leg on and enforce a little bit more strictly. Or very quickly, what we're seeing right now with new EPR is the rise of compliance-based business models. So there's a new extended producer responsibility law in town. You're a multinational corporation producing huge amounts of telecommunications waste or plastic waste, for example. I estimate that within 12 months' time, you will be non-compliant. I, as a service provider, will effectively provide you with a public indemnification insurance. So I'm legally indemnifying you against an oncoming EPR piece of legislation that you are ill-suited to understand because you do not have the cohort of environmental skill sets that I have with my waste management company. I've now diversified my business model from the inherent value of the commodity that I am collecting to a legal indemnification service that I am now providing through a management fee, which is far more reliable than fluctuations in the PET recycling market, for example.
Yeah, I mean, actually, we've had a question from the floor from Jenna Wallace-Jones, who's asked, Josh, I think maybe you could answer this as well. To what extent do you think EPR will drive innovation in packaging? And do you think this will have an impact on weight-based recycling targets?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you look at kind of the high kind of cost of landfilling and the high tipping fee in the United Kingdom, a lot of innovation in waste valorization in the United Kingdom is not based on the inherent economics of that business model working, right? AD, biogas investments, for example, Black Soldier 5 farming investments that we've made in East Africa don't make sense on the inherent business principles of what we are actually doing. It's because the alternative is so expensive that it's actually a cheaper model. That if that I believe is kind of a micro, EPR orientated development. If you have an extremely high cost of landfilling per metric ton for construction and demolition waste, for example, then almost any other business model that isn't as prohibitively expensive is now fair game. It doesn't matter if the kind of inherent economics without the EPR didn't work. The EPR is now in place, and I'm too big of a company to fall through the cracks, and so I have to do it. So I think definitely EPR supports innovation.
To kind of zoom out a little bit, we've had a question from Shelley Holmes, who says it would be good to understand how the panel believes the circular economy could help solve the issues we've been discussing today. Roland, potentially I'll come to you. The example she's raised is perhaps there'd be fewer vehicles needed if fewer plastics were created or kept in use for longer. How else could the circular economy help solve the problems of the day?
That's a good question. I think for me, I kind of see the circular economy as the efficiency economy. So, and I mean, Simon kind of mentioned the Ellin MacArthur Foundation in the beginning, and there it's about not creating waste in the first place. But what does that actually imply? It implies that everything is always a resource. And I mean, this is obviously let's say a little bit of a philosophical mindset. And for me, the important thing is to bring that into reality, to bring pragmatism to idealism, to try and understand what are the nuts and bolts of what needs to happen in order to reuse, in order to elevate materials to facilitate their continued use, to make sure as little as possible drops out the system, which means we only need to add a little bit into the system, which again is all about efficiency. So for me, that's how I see it working, and I see that working by integrating businesses who should be working together, because they either have demand or supply of a material that is needed, and in that way we allow less material to escape our system, and we keep it circulating.
I mean, Simon, do you have any thoughts? How can we use the circular economy to kind of overcome the challenges of our modern world?
I actually agree with Roland on that, actually, and Roland used a great word there, and it's maybe something that I've tried to bring across in my presentation, etc. You know, and that's pragmatism. You know, there's always a danger if we deal with this philosophical concept that, you know, we come up with sort of philosophical answers, really, and a philosophical operation, if there is such a thing, that you know, we do it because, you know, it is a philosophy rather than actually what works on the ground. And you know, I think we've got to be pragmatic, and we've got to say, you know, what actually works. And it's about integrating the whole supply chain. You know, and that starts off with EPR, and you know, it's making decisions that are joined up across the whole of the supply chain, and that we measure it properly. You know, and be far better and make far better use of data, which is, you know, woefully lacking at the moment, to allow us to make informed decisions. And I think if we get that right, and that we introduce everything in a pragmatic way and make difficult decisions, then, you know, everything points to, you know, a circular economy that can largely work.
I mean, perhaps it takes us back to the title of this very webinar. I'll come to you, Josh. Is a truly circular economy possible?
No, it's not. No, it's clearly
interesting. Why?
It's clearly not. I mean, you have far too kind of unrealistic consumer demands. You don't have political willingness of it. I like what Roland coined as kind of circular efficiency, right? I mean, the problem with circular economy is their proudest case study examples are based on cottage industries. You know, they're based on floor tiles made from recycled HDPE, a very small scale off-grid biogas digester, refill schemes in kind of the most progressive Western cities of the world. I mean, you're not going to sell this to consumers at the bottom of the pyramid and the global billions who have competing interests, you know, with sanitation and kind of hygiene problems. Even all of the economic models that we've been speaking about for the last 45 minutes associated with EPR, social and kind of fair trade plastic movements, for example, they're all based on false economies. They're all arguing that conventional economics has failed waste management and recycling initiatives, and that the only way to actually pay for it is to design, in a very cunning approach, an artificial subsidy through carbon trading, through social plastic credits, for example, through compliance kind of based indemnification insurance kind of models. I mean, these are all telltale signs that a circular economy is a bit too wishy-washy, and that idealists are, you know, actually a little bit unhelpful in the same room. I mean, you have, again, going back to that argument I made, huge amounts of money being spent on petrochemical extraction. So as environmentalists, we're fighting a battle against petrochemical lobbyists. You know, we need to come to the room with chemical engineers, with brick and mortar lawyers, with economists, and figure out the more progressive iterative models that are pragmatic and that fit within existing fiduciary and legal structures. Of course, you're going to get signatories to sign up to a UN agreement that says, stop allowing plastic to enter into the ocean. I mean, it's brilliantly ambiguous and arbitrary to the point that anybody would agree with it. But from a pragmatic perspective, how are you actually going to insert this into fast-moving consumer good supply chains and value chains? How are you actually going to speak to a lawyer about this and win a legal case? You know, there's some really, really great work that's being done by this organization I saw in Singapore called Client Earth. And they're very much basing a lot of their environmental legal wins in this area against EPR on, you know, brick and mortar legal structures, on things that have existed for generations, for many, many years. They're not basing it off of these vague, ambiguous terms like circular economy that don't actually mean anything in legal structures and economic structures. Those aren't founded principles. They don't really translate into a pragmatic approach to solving this problem.
I mean, this is a fascinating discussion. I'm afraid to say we've only got a minute left on the webinar, but just quickly, maybe 30 seconds, and that might not be enough time. But Roland, do you agree with Josh?
So for me, I mean, it's a very true and honest assessment, and I actually kind of do agree with him, to be honest. I mean, the way that humanity lives their life at the moment just simply dictates that you cannot capture all of what we create. It is all it is very heterogeneous, the materials that we create by being alive. So I mean, for me, 100% is of course out of the question, but I do also think it's okay to concentrate on some middle ground and move in a direction towards circularity, use what we learn along the road to that point to revise and hopefully to adjust our behavior as humans, and, you know, make sure we live for another century, hopefully.
It's a nice controversial note to end on there. Unfortunately, that's just about all we have time for. And thank you everyone for your brilliant questions from the floor. And I apologise if we didn't have a chance to go over any of your points, but they're all much appreciated. I think we've had a fascinating webinar, which does leave me hopeful about the future. Clearly lots of work to do to get to the circular economy though. I'd just like to thank each of our speakers once again. So thank you very much, Dr. Simon Ellin, Joshua Palfremen and Roland Thompson. A recording of the webinar will be sent to all attendees once we finish, and I'd also like to thank you all for attending and hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.